I never wanted to be a soldier. Not really. I mean, sure, I played army men with my friends as a kid. We'd run around the neighborhood with stick rifles, ducking behind trash cans and jumping out to ambush each other. But actually going to war, that wasn't part of my plan. I was studying engineering at community college in '68 when my draft number came up. I remember staring at that letter, feeling like someone had just dropped a brick in my stomach. My dad had served in Korea, came back with a limp and nightmares he never talked about. Mom cried for 3 days straight when I told her. I thought about running to Canada. I really did. Had a buddy who made it up there, wrote me once to say it wasn't so bad. Cold, but the people were nice. Sometimes I wonder how different my life would have been if I'd gone that route. But I was raised to believe you don't run from your responsibilities, even when they terrify you. So I reported for duty like I was supposed to. Basic training was hell, but a predictable kind of hell. The drill sergeant screaming in your face, the endless push-ups, the blisters that turned to calluses. It was designed to break you down and build you back up as something else. Something harder. Something that could kill and maybe die without hesitation. I wasn't sure it worked on me. I followed orders, learned what I needed to learn, but always felt like I was playing a role. Like the real me was hidden somewhere deep inside, watching everything from a distance. Vietnam hit me like a freight train. The heat was the first thing that got to me. Thick, wet heat that made it feel like you were breathing through a hot sponge. I arrived in country in January 1969, assigned to the 25th Infantry Division. They called us Tropic Lightning. Nothing poetic about it once you were in the jungle, though. I was part of a platoon that conducted search and destroy missions in the Iron Triangle. We'd go out for days at a time, humping through jungles so dense you could barely see 10 feet ahead. The weight of your gear, your weapon, your ammo, it all felt like it was trying to pull you straight down into the mud. And the mud was everywhere. It got into everything. Your boots, your clothes, your food, your soul. I remember my first firefight. We were moving through a rubber plantation when the world exploded around us. The crack of AK-47s, the zip of bullets passing too close, the shouting. I froze, just completely locked up. My squad leader had to physically shove me into a drainage ditch. I lay there, face pressed into stinking water, certain I was about to die. But I didn't. Not that day. After that, I learned what everyone learns in combat, that fear is always there, but you function anyway. You train your hands to do what they need to do, even when your mind is screaming. You learn to live in the moment because thinking too far ahead is unbearable. You learn that the guy next to you matters more than anything else in the world, even if you met him just 2 weeks ago. My best friend over there was a guy named Donnie Martinez from New Mexico. He had this easy laugh that seemed completely out of place in the horror show we were living in. He collected little jade Buddha statues from the villages we passed through, said they brought good luck. He gave me one that I kept in my breast pocket, right next to the picture of my high school girlfriend. This little guy will keep the bad juju away, he told me with that grin of his. Trust me on this one, brother. I wasn't religious or spiritual back then. My family went to church on Easter and Christmas, and that was about it. But in Vietnam, guys got superstitious fast. Some wore crosses, some carried rabbit's feet, some had rituals they'd perform before heading out on patrol. You grab onto anything that might give you an edge against the statistical nightmare that was our daily existence. We'd been in country for about 4 months when we lost Donnie. We were securing a village and he stepped on a mine. 1 second he was there, laughing about something, and the next, parts of him were scattered across the trail. I helped collect what was left. That night, I took the jade Buddha from my pocket and threw it as far as I could into the jungle. Some good luck charm. After Donnie, something changed in me. I went numb. I did my job, followed orders, watched the days tick by on my short timer's calendar. 60 more days in country. 50. 45. I started to believe I might actually make it home. It was September 12th, 1969. I remember the date because it would have been my grandfather's birthday. We were escorting a convoy through an area that intelligence said was relatively secure. Relatively secure in Vietnam meant you only had a moderate chance of dying that day. The road wound through these hills covered in elephant grass. Beautiful country if you could forget where you were and why. The sun was high, creating that hazy, dreamlike atmosphere that sometimes settled over the jungle in the early afternoon. Our lieutenant had us spread out along the convoy. 3 deuce-and-a-half trucks carrying supplies to a fire base about 20 clicks away. I was walking point, scanning the tree line, when I felt something strange. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was more like a shift in the air. Like when you're a kid and you walk into a room where adults have just been arguing, but now they're silent. The hairs on my arms stood up. I raised my fist, the signal to stop. The convoy ground to a halt behind me. I knelt, trying to figure out what had triggered my internal alarm. Nothing moved in the tree line. No birds called. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. "What you got, Jensen?" The lieutenant called from behind me. "Not sure, sir," I replied, still scanning. "Something doesn't feel right." He came up beside me, binoculars out, sweeping the hills. "I don't see anything, but if your spidey sense is tingling, we'll check it out." He'd learned to trust the weird instincts guys developed after a few months in country. He sent 2 men to scout the ridgeline to our left. I watched them move up through the grass, their hunched forms disappearing and reappearing as they climbed. They were about halfway up when I heard it. The distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle, followed immediately by the wet thud of a bullet finding flesh. One of the scouts crumpled, sliding several feet back down the hill before coming to rest. The second dove for cover. Another shot rang out, kicking up dirt near the fallen man. "Sniper!" I yelled, though everyone already knew. "Get to cover!" Chaos erupted. The convoy drivers were trying to turn their vehicles around on the narrow road. Men were diving into ditches or behind the trucks. The lieutenant was on the radio, calling for air support. And all the while, methodical shots came from somewhere in the hills, each one finding a target with terrifying precision. I made it to a shallow depression beside the road, pressed myself into the dirt, and tried to locate the shooter. The shots seemed to be coming from a rocky outcropping about 400 meters up the opposite hillside. I could see small puffs of smoke after each report, but no sign of the sniper himself. Our machine gunner set up and began laying down suppressive fire toward the hill. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. The sniper shots stopped. We started to regroup, to form a plan to either push forward or retreat. That's when I made my mistake. I raised my head just a little too high, trying to get a better look at the hillside. I remember having just enough time to think, "That's odd. There's a flash of light up there." And then a sledgehammer hit me in the chest. I've read accounts from other guys who've been shot. Some say it burns like fire. Others say it feels like being punched really hard. For me, it was cold. A strange, spreading cold that started in my chest and raced outward. I looked down and saw a dark stain blooming across my fatigues. My hands went to the wound automatically, pressing down like we'd been trained to do. But there was so much blood, pulsing between my fingers with each heartbeat. "Medic!" Someone was shouting. "Man down! Medic!" I tried to speak but couldn't get enough air. I remember thinking with strange clarity, "This is it. This is how I die." In the mud on some nameless road in Vietnam. I wasn't even afraid anymore. Just disappointed. 21 years old, and this was all I'd get. The sky above me seemed to grow brighter, almost painfully so. Faces appeared in my narrowing field of vision. The medic, his features tight with concentration. The lieutenant, shouting orders I could no longer understand. My buddy Wilson, his eyes wide with a fear I couldn't feel anymore. The medic was working on me, cutting away my shirt, pressing bandages to my chest. I wanted to tell him not to bother, that I could feel myself slipping away, but no words would come. My mouth tasted like pennies. Breathing became a monumental effort, each inhale a little shallower than the last. "Stay with me, Jensen," the medic was saying, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "God damn it, don't you clock out on me. Medevac is on the way." But I was already leaving. The pain began to recede, replaced by a strange lightness. The sounds of the battlefield, the shouting, the sporadic gunfire, the whine of the radio, all faded into a soft, cottony silence. I felt myself drifting upward, away from my body, away from Vietnam, away from everything. And then, darkness, complete and absolute. I don't know how long I floated in that darkness. Time seemed to have no meaning there. It could have been seconds or centuries. But gradually I became aware of something else in the void with me. A presence, not frightening, but immense. Like standing at the foot of a mountain so large you can't see its peak. I couldn't see it, not with eyes anyway, but I could feel it. A vast consciousness that somehow enveloped me while also being separate. And along with this presence came a sense of peace, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not happiness exactly, but a profound rightness. Like every question I'd ever had was answered, even though I couldn't articulate the questions or the answers. Then light began to appear, not coming from anywhere specific, just gradually lightening the darkness around me. And with the light came memories, not just playing in my mind, but surrounding me as if I was reliving them. I saw myself as a child, climbing the big oak tree in our backyard, My mother's voice calling me to be careful. I saw my father teaching me to fish, his large, calloused hands showing me how to bait the hook. I saw my first kiss with Sally Winters behind the bleachers at homecoming. I saw Donnie Martinez grinning as he handed me that jade Buddha. But I didn't just see these moments. I felt them from all sides. I experienced my mother's love and worry as she watched me climb that tree. I felt my father's pride in his own memories of fishing with his father. I knew Sally's nervousness and excitement before our lips touched. I understood Donnie's genuine belief that he was protecting me with his gift. It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing how connected everything in my life had been. How each moment, each relationship had shaped me and been shaped by me. How nothing was truly isolated or random. The present seemed to be guiding me through these memories, though not in any directed way. It was more like it was holding space for me to see and understand. And as I moved through my life, I began to notice something else. The ripples. Every action, every word I'd ever spoken, sent out ripples that touched others in ways I'd never realized. The time I'd helped Mrs. Abernathy carry her groceries home when I was 10 had brightened a day that had been filled with grief for her after receiving bad news about her son in Vietnam. The moment I'd stood up for a kid being bullied in 9th grade had given him the courage to stand up for someone else later. Even small kindnesses, a smile, a held door, a shared lunch, created waves of effect I could now perceive. But so did the hurts. I saw how my angry words to my mother before leaving for Vietnam had wounded her deeply, adding to the fear she already carried. I saw how my careless rejection of a girl who'd asked me to dance in high school had fed her already fragile self-image. I witnessed my moments of cowardice, selfishness, and cruelty with the same clarity as my moments of courage, generosity, and love. There was no judgment from the presence, only a profound understanding that swept me up as well. I wasn't being punished for my failures or rewarded for my good deeds. I was simply being shown the truth of my existence, its beauty and its brokenness together. As this panorama of my life unfolded around me, I became aware of other presences joining the first. These felt different, more familiar, more human. And as they drew closer, I began to recognize them. There was Donnie, but not as the broken body we'd collected from that trail. He was whole and radiant, his essence unmistakable even without a physical form. There was my grandfather, who died when I was 12, his presence carrying the same quiet strength I remembered. There were others I recognized, a childhood friend who'd drowned, an uncle who'd passed from cancer, even people I'd barely known in life, but who seemed intimately familiar now. They surrounded me with what I can only describe as love, though that word feels too small for what I experienced. It was acceptance so complete, connection so profound that it dissolved any sense of separation between us. We were individual notes in the same cosmic melody, distinct but harmonized. Donnie's presence came closer, and suddenly I could hear him, not with ears, but directly in my consciousness. "Didn't expect to see you so soon, brother," he communicated, and I could feel his familiar humor wrapped around genuine concern. I tried to respond, to ask what was happening, where I was, but I had no voice in this place. Yet he seemed to understand my questions anyway. "You're at the threshold," he conveyed. "Not quite here, not quite there. It's not your time yet, Jensen." "Not my time?" I didn't understand. I'd been shot. I'd felt myself die. My grandfather's presence moved closer. "You have more to do," came his message, carrying the same gentle authority he'd had in life. More to learn, more to give. A wave of protest rose in me. I didn't want to go back to the pain, the fear, the mud and blood of Vietnam. This place, wherever, whatever it was, felt like home in a way no physical location ever had. The peace here was complete, the love unconditional. Why would I leave this for the horror of war? The first vast presence seemed to expand around me again, and with it came understanding. My life wasn't just about me. The connections I'd seen, the ripples, they weren't finished. There were people I had yet to meet, lives I had yet to touch, lessons I had yet to learn and teach. Images began to flow around me, but not memories this time. These were moments that hadn't happened yet. A woman with kind eyes and a smile that felt like sunshine. Children, 2 boys with my chin and their mother's eyes. Friends gathered around a table, raising glasses. Students looking to me with questions and trust. Veterans finding healing in shared stories. I saw a future stretching out with possibilities I couldn't have imagined. A life rich with purpose, with love, with meaning that grew from this very experience I was having now. It will hurt. Donnie's presence conveyed, and I could feel his compassion. Going back always hurts, but you'll carry this with you. Not the details maybe, but the truth of it. Remember, my grandfather added, you are more than what happens to you. More than your wounds. More than your wars. Remember, the light around me began to intensify, not painfully, but with increasing urgency. The presences of my loved ones seemed to recede slightly, though I could still feel them with me. And the vast consciousness that had held this entire experience began to communicate something directly to me. Not in words, but in pure understanding. I was loved beyond measure. We all were. Every person I'd ever met would ever meet, loved completely, unconditionally. The divisions we created between ourselves, nationality, race, belief, all of it, were illusions. At our core, we were expressions of the same unimaginable creative force. The message felt branded into my essence. Remember this. Live from this. Share this truth, not just in words, but in how you treat every person you encounter. They are you and you are them, and all are held in this love. The light grew blinding. The peace began to be replaced by sensation. Sharp, insistent, painful. I felt myself being pulled back, away from the light, away from the presences, back towards something heavy and confined. Not yet, I tried to call out. Please, not yet. But the transition had begun. The light contracted to a single point, then winked out. The love and wisdom I'd been bathed in began to recede like a tide pulling back from shore. I was falling, spinning, compressing back into something too small to contain what I just experienced. And then pain, real, physical, overwhelming pain. A weight on my chest, a burning in my lungs, voices frantic and distant. We've got a pulse. He's back. Bright lights, different from the light I'd been in. Harsh, clinical. The rattle and hum of helicopter blades, the smell of blood and antiseptic. Stay with us, soldier. You're gonna make it. I tried to speak, to tell them about what I'd seen, what I'd learned. But a mask covered my face, pumping oxygen into struggling lungs. My body felt like a lead suit I'd been forced back into. Heavy, restrictive, agonizing. Faces swam above me. The medic from the convoy, a helicopter crew member, someone in a surgical mask. They looked ghostly, less real than the presences I'd just been with. I wanted to reach up, to grab one of them, to make them understand what had happened. But my arms wouldn't respond to my commands. BP's dropping again. We're losing him. The pain began to recede once more. The lights dimmed. For a moment, I thought I was returning to that other place, and relief washed through me. But this was different. This was just darkness closing in, consciousness slipping away. The last thing I remember is a voice, not from anyone in the helicopter, but from somewhere deep inside me, or perhaps from everywhere around me. The same message as before, remember. And then nothing. I later learned that I'd been clinically dead for nearly 4 minutes after the sniper's bullet tore through my chest, missing my heart by less than an inch, but collapsing my right lung and severing a major artery. The medic had managed to restart my heart with manual CPR, but I'd coded again in the medevac helicopter on the way to the field hospital. They'd brought me back that time too, though it had been close. I spent 3 weeks in various military hospitals, first in Vietnam, then Japan, finally Walter Reed back in the States. The doctors called my survival miraculous. The bullet had done damage that should have been fatal, especially given the time it took to get me to proper medical care. One surgeon told me he'd never seen anyone survive injuries like mine without immediate access to a fully equipped OR. Physically, I recovered more quickly than anyone expected. But mentally, emotionally, I wasn't the same person who'd walked point on that convoy. How could I be after what I'd experienced? I didn't talk about it at first, partly because I didn't have the words for it, partly because I was afraid of being sedated, diagnosed with combat fatigue, or just plain not believed. So I kept it inside, turning it over in my mind during the long nights in the hospital when pain kept me awake. The details were already fading, like a dream does upon waking. But the essence remained, that profound sense of connection, of being held in something larger than myself. The understanding that love was not just an emotion, but the fundamental fabric of reality itself. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between consciousness and sleep, I could almost feel them again. Donnie, my grandfather, the others, and that vast, encompassing presence that had shown me my life from both sides of the veil. In those moments, the sterile hospital room would seem to fill with light, and the pain in my healing body would ease. One night, about 2 weeks into my stay at Walter Reed, A nurse came in to check my vitals and found me weeping silently. She was an older woman, Vietnamese American, with gentle hands and eyes that had seen more suffering than most. "Bad dreams?" she asked softly, adjusting my IV. I shook my head. "Good ones," I whispered. "Too good. That's why I'm crying." She looked at me for a long moment, then sat on the edge of the bed. It wasn't protocol, but it was late, and the ward was quiet. "You saw something, didn't you?" she asked. "When you were away." I studied her face, searching for signs of judgment or disbelief. "Found none." "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I saw everything." She nodded as if this made perfect sense. "My grandmother in Vietnam, she said she was a healer in her village. She used to say that some people go to the edge and come back with pieces of the other side still clinging to them, like seeds that will grow into something new." "Do you believe in that?" I asked. She adjusted my blanket with practiced efficiency. "I've been a nurse for 27 years. I've seen too much to dismiss anything." She paused. "Do you want to tell me what you saw?" And so, in the quiet of that hospital night, I told someone for the first time. Not everything, I couldn't articulate it all, but enough. She listened without interruption, her face calm and attentive. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and took my hand, her touch professional but kind. "You've been given something rare," she said finally. "A glimpse behind the curtain. Most of us have to take it on faith." "What do I do with it?" I asked, feeling suddenly like a child seeking guidance. "You live," she replied simply. "You live differently because now you know." She stood up, checked my chart one last time. As she turned to leave, she added, "And maybe someday, when the time is right, you share what you've learned. There are people who need to hear it." After she left, I lay awake watching the moonlight create patterns on the hospital wall. For the first time since returning, I felt a sense of purpose stirring. Not clarity yet, but a direction. A reason for having been sent back. The vast presence had shown me the interconnectedness of all things, how every action created ripples that touched countless other lives. If that was true, and I knew in my soul it was, then perhaps this experience itself was meant to ripple outward from me to others. I fell asleep with that thought. And for the first time since the sniper's bullet found me, I didn't dream of light or darkness, of Donnie or my grandfather. I dreamed of the future, hazy and uncertain, but undeniably there, waiting for me to step into it. A week later, I was discharged from Walter Reed with a Purple Heart, a medical retirement from the Army, and a body that the doctors warned would never be quite the same. The bullet wound had healed well enough, but there was nerve damage that would cause chronic pain, and my right lung capacity was permanently reduced. Small prices to pay for a second chance at life. My parents met me at the hospital, my mother crying and touching my face as if to make sure I was real. My father standing stiffly nearby, emotion visible only in the tightness around his eyes. They'd been told I probably wouldn't survive the medevac flight, then that I might not make it through surgery, then that complications could still take me. Each time I defied the predictions. "It's a miracle," my mother kept saying on the drive home to Pennsylvania. "God was watching over you." I didn't correct her, didn't try to explain that what I'd experienced didn't fit neatly into the framework of Sunday school lessons. That would come later, when I'd found better words for it. For now, I just squeezed her hand and said, "Yes, I was watched over." My father, a man who'd come back from Korea with his own ghosts, asked fewer questions. But that night, as I sat on the back porch of my childhood home, looking at stars I'd thought I'd never see again, he joined me with 2 glasses of whiskey. "Here," he said, handing me one. "Doctor said no alcohol with your meds, but one won't kill you." A pause. "Not after what you've already survived." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping the whiskey that burned a path down to my stomach. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I know that look," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Saw it in some men in Korea, men who'd been somewhere else for a while." I turned to look at him, surprised. In all his stories of the war, he'd never mentioned anything like this. "Did you?" I began. He shook his head. "Not me, but my buddy Lewis." Artillery shell landed right next to us. I got thrown clear. "Lewis." They worked on him for a long time. Said his heart stopped twice. He took another sip of whiskey. He was different after. Calmer. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. "What happened to him?" I asked. "Became a minister after the war?" Not the fire and brimstone type. The kind that just talked about love a lot. My father shrugged. "Never made sense to me until I saw that same look in your eyes at the hospital." I considered telling him then, laying out the whole experience. But something held me back. Not fear that he wouldn't believe me, but a sense that I wasn't ready yet. That the experience was still settling in me, finding its place in my understanding of the world. So instead I just said, I'm still figuring it out. He nodded, accepting this. Take your time. Some things can't be rushed. He finished his whiskey and stood. You'll know when you're ready to talk about it. If you ever are. As he turned to go back inside, he paused with his hand on the screen door. I'm glad you came back, son, he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. Whatever you saw over there, both in Vietnam and elsewhere, I'm just glad it sent you back to us. For the first time since returning, I felt tears prick my eyes. Me too, Dad. I managed. Me too. That night, lying in my childhood bed, surrounded by high school trophies and model airplanes I'd built with my father, I felt the presence again. Not as overwhelming as before, but unmistakable. That sense of vast, loving awareness enfolding me. And with it came Donnie's presence, distinct but harmonious with the greater consciousness. Told you you'd remember, I felt rather than heard him communicate. Not everything, but enough. I smiled in the darkness. I miss you, I thought back. I'm not far, came the impression of his response. None of us are. The veil is thinner than most people think. Will I see you again? I asked silently. The sense I received wasn't exactly words, but if translated, it would be something like, you're seeing me now, just not with your eyes. But yes, when it's really your time, I'll be among those waiting. No rush, though. You've got work to do first. Work, purpose, the future glimpses I'd been shown. But what exactly was I meant to do with this experience? How was I supposed to carry the immensity of what I'd learned back into ordinary life? As if in response to my unspoken question, I felt a wave of gentle reassurance from the presence. Not specific directions, but a sense that the path would reveal itself step by step. That I didn't need to force anything or figure it all out at once. The message was clear. Just live from what you now know. The rest will follow naturally. With that comfort surrounding me, I fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd had since Vietnam. The next weeks and months were a period of adjustment to civilian life, to my healing body with its new limitations, to carrying the weight of both war experiences and spiritual revelation. I went through the motions of normal life, physical therapy appointments, paperwork for my veterans' benefits, catching up with high school friends who couldn't possibly understand what I'd been through. My near-death experience remained a closely guarded secret. I mentioned it only once to my parish priest, who listened politely but then pivoted to talking about the rewards of heaven awaiting the faithful after a lifetime of devotion. It was clear he saw my experience as either a hallucination or, at best, a preview of what I might earn later if I lived righteously. Neither interpretation resonated with what I'd experienced, so I kept it private, though its effects on me were visible to anyone who knew me before. I was quieter, more contemplative, less interested in material pursuits, more drawn to nature and simple human connections. The nightmares that plagued many Vietnam vets rarely troubled me. When they did come, they dissolved upon waking into the greater peace I carried. But I was restless. The work I felt I was meant to do remained undefined. I took a job at my uncle's hardware store, more to occupy my days than out of any real interest. I dated occasionally, but found it hard to connect romantically when I couldn't share the most profound experience of my life. Then about 7 months after coming home, I was restocking shelves when a customer approached. An older man with a Korean War veteran's cap. You serve in Nam? He asked abruptly, gesturing to the slight limp I still had from nerve damage. Yes, sir, I replied. 25th Infantry. He nodded, his eyes taking on a distant look I recognized. Korea myself. 1951 to 52. Frozen Chosin. I whistled softly. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir was legendary for its brutality and the extreme conditions troops had faced. That must have been hell, I said. Parts of it, he agreed. Other parts, he hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Other parts were something else entirely. There was something in his tone, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. What do you mean? I asked carefully. He glanced around the empty aisle, then lowered his voice. Got caught in a mortar attack. Medics said I was gone for almost 6 minutes before they got me back. His eyes held mine, searching. But I wasn't gone. I was somewhere else. My heart began to pound. Light, I asked, barely above a whisper. Presences? His weathered face transformed, eyes widening, mouth opening slightly in shock. Then slowly he nodded. You too? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sniper. Vietnam. 4 minutes clinically dead. We stood there in the hardware store aisle, two soldiers from different wars, separated by age and experience, but connected by something profound that transcended both. "I've never told anyone who really understood," he said finally. "My wife tries, God bless her, but how do you describe the indescribable?" I finished for him. "Exactly." He extended his hand. "Frank Donahue, Mike Jensen." We ended up at a diner down the street talking for hours. His experience had differences from mine. He described moving through a tunnel, encountering a being of light rather than distinct presences of loved ones. But the core was the same, the overwhelming love, the sense of connection to all things, the message that life has meaning beyond what we can ordinarily perceive. "Chummy, changed everything for me," Frank said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Came back with no fear of death, but a much greater appreciation for life. Started seeing beauty everywhere, even in hard times." "Have you told many people?" I asked. He shook his head. "Family knows a little, a couple of close friends, but most people," he shrugged, "they don't have a framework for it. They try to fit it into whatever they already believe, or they dismiss it entirely." I nodded, understanding completely. "But you know what I've learned?" He continued. "People who've been through their own dark nights, war, loss, illness, whatever it might be, they're often more open to hearing about it. Like suffering cracks them open enough to let new light in." Something clicked into place for me then. The future glimpses I'd been shown during my experience. The students looking to me with trust, the veterans finding healing in shared stories. What if this was the work I was meant to do? Not converting people to a new belief system, but simply sharing my experience with those who might need to hear it most? "Frank," I said slowly, "have you ever thought about speaking to other veterans about your experience?" "Formally, I mean." He raised his eyebrows. "Can't say that I have." "Why?" "Because I think that might be what I'm supposed to do." The words came out with a certainty that surprised even me. But as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. This was the first step on the path that had been waiting for me to find it. Frank considered this, then nodded. "Could be powerful. A lot of boys coming back from Nam with souls torn up worse than their bodies. Message like ours might be exactly what some of them need to hear." We talked through possibilities, veterans groups, hospitals, informal gatherings. By the time we parted ways, exchanging phone numbers with promises to stay in touch, I felt more clear and purposeful than I had since returning from Vietnam. That night, as I lay in bed reflecting on the seemingly chance encounter with Frank, I felt the familiar presence envelop me again. And with it came a sense of affirmation so strong, it brought tears to my eyes. Yes, this was the beginning. This was why I'd been sent back. The presence didn't speak in words, but if it had, I think it would have said, "Now you understand. Now you can begin." And in the peaceful darkness of my room, surrounded by that loving awareness that had never really left me since the moment on that dusty Vietnam road, I made a promise to honor the gift I'd been given by sharing it with others who might need its light. Little did I know then how many lives would be touched by that decision, or how the simple act of sharing my story would create ripples that would continue long after I was gone. But that night, for the first time since the sniper's bullet found me, I felt truly fully alive again, and certain of my purpose in this second chance at life. My meeting with Frank was the first domino in what became a lifelong mission. Over coffee the following week, he connected me with a VA counselor he knew who ran group therapy sessions for returning Vietnam vets. The counselor, a World War II vet named Bill Harrington, was initially skeptical about bringing what he called spiritual experiences into his clinical approach. But he also admitted that traditional methods weren't reaching many of the men who needed help most. "These boys come back with 1,000-yard stares and souls full of shrapnel," Bill told me when we met in his cluttered office. "The psychiatrists give them pills for the nightmares and tremors, but that doesn't touch the deeper wound." He leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "So if you've got something that might help even one of them find peace, I'm willing to give it a try." He invited me to attend his Thursday night group as a guest speaker. That gave me 3 days to prepare what I would say and how I would say it. I'd never been much of a public speaker, even before Vietnam. The thought of standing up in front of a room full of fellow vets and talking about something so personal, so beyond ordinary experience, made my palms sweat and my recently healed lung feel tight. I spent hours drafting and redrafting what I would say, trying to find words for the ineffable. Nothing seemed adequate. How do you describe colors to someone born blind? How do you convey the sensation of swimming to someone who's never felt water? The experience lived in me as feeling, as knowing, not as something that could be neatly packaged in words. The night before the meeting, I called Frank in something close to panic. "I can't do this," I blurted when he answered. "I don't have the right words. They'll think I'm crazy or making it up or—" "Jensen," he cut me off firmly. "Stop thinking so much. These aren't civilians who've lived sheltered lives. These are men who've seen the worst humanity has to offer. Many of them have been close to death themselves." "But what if—" "No what ifs," he interrupted again. "Just tell your story. Tell it true. The ones who need to hear it will hear it. The rest—" I could almost see him shrugging through the phone. "Well, not everyone's ready for every truth at the same time." His words calmed me, reminded me of what I'd felt so clearly the night after we met. That sense of purpose, of rightness. I slept better than I expected, and when I woke, there was a clarity I hadn't had before. I would simply tell my story as honestly as I could and trust that it would reach whoever needed to hear it. The VA group met in a church basement. Neutral territory, Bill had explained. Less clinical than the hospital. When I arrived, men were already gathering, some clustered in small groups talking quietly, others sitting alone, eyes watchful. They ranged from boys barely out of their teens to men in their early 30s, but all had that particular look I recognized from my own reflection. The look of someone who had seen too much, too soon. Bill introduced me simply as Mike Jensen, 25th Infantry, who has something he'd like to share about his experience coming home. Then he nodded for me to take over. I stood, feeling the weight of their gazes. Some curious, some suspicious, most simply guarded. Men who had learned the hard way not to trust easily or hope too much. I took a sniper's bullet outside Tay Nian in September '69. I began, my voice surprisingly steady. The medic said my heart stopped for 4 minutes before they got me back. The doctors later called my survival a miracle. I paused, taking in the room. But the real miracle wasn't that I survived. It was what happened during those 4 minutes. Then I simply told them about the darkness giving way to light, about meeting Donnie and my grandfather and others who had passed, about the vast presence that showed me my life from both sides, about the profound love and connection I'd experienced, about the message I'd been given to remember and share. I didn't try to interpret it or fit it into any religious framework. I didn't claim to understand all of it myself. I just shared what I had experienced as directly and honestly as I could. When I finished, the room was silent. Not the awkward silence of people who don't know what to say, but the deep silence of men absorbing something that resonated at a level beyond words. Finally, one man spoke. A gaunt, haunted-looking guy with a Marine Corps tattoo who had been staring at the floor throughout my story. "I was at Khe-Sanh," he said, his voice rough with emotion, or maybe just cigarettes. "Got hit by mortar fragments. Bled out before the medics could reach me." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "I saw the light too. Felt everything you described. Haven't told a soul because who the hell would believe me?" His voice broke slightly. "But it was real. Most real thing I've ever experienced." Another man raised his hand tentatively. "Wesiti." Building collapsed on me after an RPG hit. They dug me out 20 minutes later. No pulse. He shook his head in wonder. I didn't see my dead relatives, but there was this gritty presence. Exactly like you said. Like being held in something bigger than anything I could imagine. One by one, others began to speak. Not all had near-death experiences to share, but many had questions. Genuine, searching questions free from mockery or disbelief. What did it mean for how we live now? Did it change how I felt about the war, about killing? Did I still fear death? Was there judgment for the things we'd done? I answered as honestly as I could, always emphasizing that this was my experience, not a doctrine I was trying to convert them to. When I didn't know, I said I didn't know. But the core messages, that we are profoundly connected to each other, that love is the fundamental reality, that our actions create ripples that affect others in ways we can't imagine. These I could speak about with absolute conviction. By the end of the evening, something had shifted in the room. There was an openness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Some men were wiping away tears. Others sat straighter, as if a burden had lightened slightly. Bill watched it all with thoughtful eyes, saying little but missing nothing. As men began to leave, several came up to thank me, to share brief snippets of their own stories, or just to shake my hand with a grip that conveyed what words couldn't. The Marine from Khe-Sanh pressed something into my palm. a worn poker chip that I later learned he'd carried as a lucky charm through his entire tour. "Don't need this anymore," he said gruffly. "Not after remembering what you helped me remember tonight." Bill approached as the last of the men filtered out. "I've been running this group for 2 years," he said quietly. "Never seen them open up like that." He studied me with new respect. "There's something healing in your story, Jensen. Something these men need desperately." "So you don't think I imagined it all?" I asked, still seeking validation despite myself. He gave a short laugh. "Son, I've been a counselor for 20 years. I know the difference between delusion and authentic experience." He put a hand on my shoulder. "Whatever happened to you on that road in Vietnam was real. And the healing it's bringing to you and others, that's real too." He invited me to come back the following week, and the week after that. Soon I was a regular part of the group, sometimes sharing more aspects of my experience, sometimes just listening as others shared theirs. Word spread, and men from other therapy groups began to attend. Then veterans from other VA facilities in neighboring towns. 6 months in, Bill helped me establish my own group specifically focused on near-death experiences and their aftermath. We called it Glimpses Beyond. Neutral language that didn't align with any particular religion, but conveyed the essence of what we discussed. Not everyone who came had an NDE. Many were simply searching for meaning in what they'd been through, for some purpose to the suffering they'd witnessed and endured. Some came skeptical and left unchanged, but others found in our conversations a framework that helped them make sense of their experiences, and more importantly, a perspective that eased their pain and guilt. One attendee, a former Army nurse who'd served in a field hospital, put it best. "I've seen so many die, held their hands as they slipped away and wondered where they were going. If what you experienced is real, and in my heart I believe it is, then maybe all this wasn't just senseless waste. Maybe there's mercy on the other side of all this suffering." As word of our group spread further, I began receiving invitations to speak at other veterans organizations, PTSD treatment programs, even civilian grief support groups. I never sought these opportunities out. They found me through the growing network of people whose lives had been touched by hearing about my experience. About a year into this work, I received a call from a researcher at the University of Virginia, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was conducting studies on near-death experiences. He'd heard about our group through a colleague at the VA and wanted to interview me for his research. I was hesitant at first, wary of having my profound, personal experience reduced to clinical data points. But when we spoke, I found Dr. Stevenson to be genuinely open-minded and respectful. He wasn't looking to debunk what I'd experienced, but to understand it better. "What you're describing," he told me after I shared my story, "is remarkably consistent with accounts we've collected from people across different cultures, religions, and circumstances. The details vary, but the core elements, the light, the profound sense of love and acceptance, the life review, the encounter with deceased loved ones, these appear again and again." What do you make of that?" I asked. "As a scientist, I can say the consistency is compelling evidence that something genuine is occurring," he replied carefully. "Something beyond what our current medical understanding can fully explain." He paused. "As a human being, I find it deeply moving and hopeful." He asked if I would be willing to be formally interviewed as part of his research study, and I agreed. That interview led to connections with other researchers in the emerging field of near-death studies, and eventually to an invitation to speak at a conference being organized by Dr. Raymond Moody, who would later coin the term near-death experience in his groundbreaking book. Suddenly, what had begun as personal healing shared with a small group of fellow veterans was expanding into something much larger. I found myself part of a growing community of NDE experiencers, researchers, and healthcare providers who were working to bring these experiences into the light of serious consideration. But even as my world expanded in these new directions, I never lost sight of where my true purpose lay, with the veterans who, like me, were trying to reconcile the horrors of war with the continuation of life. Their healing remained my primary focus, my most sacred responsibility. It was through this work that I met Sarah. She was a physical therapist at the VA hospital, specializing in rehabilitation for amputees and those with severe injuries. Our paths crossed when I was invited to speak to a group of medical staff about how near-death experiences might affect patient care and recovery. I noticed her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, with thoughtful green eyes and dark hair she wore in a practical braid. What caught my attention was the quality of her listening. While some of her colleagues took notes or glanced at watches, She remained completely present, absorbing every word with an openness that was rare. After my talk, when others approached with clinical questions about brain chemistry and vital signs, she waited until the crowd had thinned before coming forward. "Thank you for sharing something so personal," she said. Her voice was warm, with a slight southern lilt. "I work with men every day who are struggling to find meaning after what they've been through. Your perspective gives me a new way to think about helping them." We talked for nearly an hour, standing in that emptying conference room, then continued over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. She told me about growing up in North Carolina, about choosing physical therapy after her brother came home from Vietnam missing a leg, about her frustration with a medical system that treated bodies but often ignored the spirits inhabiting them. "These men come to me with physical wounds," she said, "but what they're really asking, whether they know it or not, is, how do I live now? How do I make sense of what happened to me? How do I find purpose again?" Her eyes held mine. Questions I can't answer with exercise routines and prosthetic fittings. "Maybe you don't need to have all the answers," I suggested. "Maybe just creating space for the questions is healing in itself." She smiled then, a smile that seemed to illuminate her from within. "That's exactly what you did today. You didn't claim to have everything figured out. You just shared your experience and let people find their own meaning in it." Something shifted between us in that moment. A recognition, a resonance I hadn't felt with anyone since my return from Vietnam. Here was someone who understood, without having had the same experience, the essence of what I was trying to share. We began seeing each other. Coffee after my support groups, dinners when our schedules aligned, long walks where we talked about everything and nothing. I found myself telling her things I'd never shared with anyone, not just about my near-death experience, but about the fear I'd felt in Vietnam, the guilt over surviving when others hadn't, the struggle to find my place in the world afterward. 3 months after we met, on a crisp fall evening with leaves crunching beneath our feet in the park, I finally worked up the courage to kiss her. When our lips met, I felt a jolt of recognition, like some part of me had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "I saw you," I blurted out afterward, the words coming before I could consider them. She drew back slightly, puzzled. What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. This was something I hadn't shared with anyone, not even in my support groups. During my experience when I was away, I saw glimpses of my future. And you were there. Not clearly. I didn't see your face or know your name. But that feeling just now when I kissed you, I recognized it. It was the same feeling I had when I saw those future moments. She was silent for a long moment, and I worried I'd said too much, sounded too strange. Then she reached up and touched my face gently. "I've felt since the day we met that there was something familiar about you," she said softly, "like I was remembering you rather than getting to know you." We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony by a lake. Frank was my best man. Some of the veterans from my support groups attended, along with researchers I'd come to know through my work with NDEs. Sarah's family was wary at first. She'd warned me that her traditional Baptist parents might struggle with some aspects of my experience, but they welcomed me warmly, recognizing the happiness their daughter had found. As we spoke our vows, I felt that familiar presence surrounding us, that vast, loving awareness that had never completely left me since my experience. And with it came the distinct impression of Donnie, my grandfather, and others I'd encountered on the other side, witnessing and blessing this moment across the thin veil that separated our worlds. Later, during our first dance, Sarah leaned close and whispered, "They're here, aren't they? The ones you told me about." I looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" She smiled. "Your face changes when you sense them. Gets this peaceful look, like you're hearing beautiful music no one else can hear." She squeezed my hand. "I may not see them myself, but I believe you do. That's enough for me." In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had found not just a wife, but a true partner in the work I was meant to do. The next few years were the happiest of my life. Sarah and I bought a small house near the VA hospital where she worked. I continued running support groups for veterans while also participating in research studies and occasionally speaking at conferences about near-death experiences. In 1975, with Sarah's encouragement, I went back to school to complete my degree, this time in psychology rather than engineering. My professors were sometimes skeptical of my interest in near-death studies, but my firsthand experience and the work I'd already done with veterans gave me insights that even the most academically accomplished couldn't dismiss entirely. Our first son, David, was born in 1976. A healthy, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and my stubborn chin. Holding him for the first time, I was overwhelmed by a sense of recognition so strong, it brought tears to my eyes. He was one of the children I'd glimpsed during my experience, now manifest in flesh and blood in my arms. "I know you," I whispered to his tiny, perfect face. "I've been waiting for you." Sarah, watching from her hospital bed, smiled through her own tears. "Tell him," she urged. "Tell him the story of how you knew he was coming." And so, to my hours-old son, who couldn't possibly understand the words, I told the story of dying on a dusty road in Vietnam and being shown glimpses of a future that included him. It was the first of countless tellings he would hear throughout his childhood, the story that shaped his understanding of his father and of life itself from his earliest days. Our second son, Michael, arrived 2 years later, completing the family I'd been shown. Our lives settled into patterns both ordinary and extraordinary. The routine of work and parenting interwoven with the ongoing exploration of the boundaries between life and death, physical and spiritual. The world was changing too. Vietnam had ended, but its ghosts lingered. The veterans I worked with spanned generations now. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, each conflict bringing its own particular wounds, yet all sharing the fundamental human struggle to find meaning in suffering. My understanding of my own experience continued to evolve as well. The more stories I heard from others who had crossed over and returned, the more I recognized both the universal elements and the deeply personal nature of each journey. Some saw religious figures that matched their upbringing. Others, like me, encountered a more generalized loving presence. Some received specific messages or tasks. Others simply came back with a transformed perspective. But beneath these variations ran common threads. The sense of being profoundly loved and accepted, the recognition of life's interconnectedness, the diminished fear of death, and the increased appreciation for living with purpose and compassion. As research into NDEs became more prevalent and respected in the 1980s, I found myself occasionally at odds with both extremes of the conversation. Some religious institutions were uncomfortable with experiences that didn't explicitly confirm their particular doctrines. Some scientific materialists were determined to reduce all such experiences to misfiring neurons and oxygen-deprived brains. I came to see my role as a bridge builder, someone who could respect both faith traditions and scientific inquiry while maintaining that some experiences transcend both current religious frameworks and scientific understanding. The mystery is part of the message. I often told skeptics from both camps, if we could fully explain or categorize these experiences, they would lose something essential. This perspective wasn't always popular, but it resonated deeply with those who had actually had the experience themselves. We knew what we knew, not as intellectual concept, but as lived reality that had transformed us from the inside out. As our sons grew into teenagers, they naturally had questions about their father's unusual work and the story they'd heard throughout their childhood. David, the more spiritually inclined of the two, embraced it wholeheartedly. By 14, he was occasionally sitting in on my veterans groups, with their permission, absorbing the stories and perspectives with a wisdom beyond his years. Michael was the skeptic, analytical, questioning, needing evidence and reason. But how do you know it wasn't just your brain creating comforting hallucinations while you were dying? He would challenge me. I don't, with absolute certainty, I would answer honestly. I can only tell you that it didn't feel like any dream or hallucination I've ever experienced. It felt more real than this conversation we're having now. He would consider this, then invariably come back with more questions days later. I never pushed either of them to accept my experience as truth. That wasn't my role as their father. I simply shared what I had lived through and let them form their own relationship to it. Sarah supported this approach. They have to find their own way. She would remind me when I worried, particularly about Michael's skepticism. Just like each of the veterans in your groups has to find their own meaning in what you share. She was right, of course. And over time, Michael's skepticism evolved into a more nuanced perspective. He went on to study neuroscience, his research partly inspired by wanting to understand the biological underpinnings of experiences like mine. David eventually became a chaplain, working with terminal patients and their families. Different paths, but both shaped by the story that had defined our family. In 1991, just as the Gulf War was beginning, sending a new generation of young men and women into combat, I faced a health crisis of my own. The damage to my lung from the sniper's bullet had created ongoing issues throughout my life. But now doctors identified a more serious concern: cardiac damage that had likely occurred during those moments when my heart had stopped in Vietnam. I needed surgery, risky at best with no guarantees of success. Sarah was terrified, though she tried to hide it for the boy's sake. I found myself in the strange position of reassuring her with the very experience that had brought us together. I've been to the other side. I reminded her the night before the surgery. I know there's nothing to fear there. She gripped my hand fiercely. That's not comforting when I need you here, she said, tears in her eyes. The boys need you here. Your veterans need you here. You're not finished yet. I held her close, feeling her fear and love like tangible things. I know, I whispered, and I fully intend to stay. But if something goes wrong, I need you to know I'm not afraid. The surgery was long and complex. When I came out of anesthesia, Sarah was there, her face showing both relief and lingering worry. The procedure had been partially successful, enough to extend my life, but not to fully repair the damage. I would need to slow down, the doctors warned. Take on less, care for my health more deliberately. During my recovery, something unexpected happened. As I lay in the hospital room, somewhere between sleep and waking, I felt the familiar presence surrounding me once again. That vast consciousness that had held me during my near-death experience. But this time, there was a new message, not in words, but in understanding implanted directly into my awareness. The work I had been doing, sharing my experience with veterans, participating in research, building bridges between spiritual and scientific perspectives, had created ripples far beyond what I could see. Lives had been transformed not just by hearing my story, but by those people then sharing their own insights with others in widening circles of impact. The message was clear. Even as my physical capabilities might diminish, the essence of my purpose remained unchanged. When I shared this with Sarah, she nodded thoughtfully. Maybe it's time to write it all down, she suggested. Not just for the people you can meet in person, but for those you'll never meet. For the future. And so, during my recovery and in the years that followed, I began to write. First in journals, then in more structured form. I recorded not just my own experience, but the patterns I'd observed across hundreds of other stories. The common elements, the variations, the impacts on lives afterward. The particular challenges and healing opportunities for combat veterans who had these experiences. As technology evolved, so did the ways I shared these accounts. In the mid-1990s, David helped me create one of the first online forums for NDE experiencers, with a special section dedicated to veterans. By the early 2000s, we had added recorded interviews and discussion guides that could be used by support groups anywhere. But even as my work found new platforms, the heart of it remained unchanged. Creating space for people to make meaning of profound experiences that existed at the boundaries of life and death, suffering and transcendence, the physical and the spiritual. The years continued their march. Our sons married and had children of their own. Sarah retired from the VA but continued working part-time with a nonprofit serving veterans' families. I gradually reduced my in-person groups as my health declined further, but maintained connections through writing, online forums, and the occasional speaking engagement when strength permitted. In 2006, Frank passed away. My friend from the hardware store, who had been the first to validate my experience and help me find my path. I felt his transition as it happened, waking from sleep with absolute certainty that he had crossed over. And for a brief luminous moment, I sensed him on the other side, reunited with the vastness of love I had experienced myself. At his memorial service, his widow pressed something into my hand. The jade Buddha that Donnie had given me in Vietnam, the one I had thrown into the jungle after his death. Frank told me to give you this if he went before you, she said. Said you'd understand what it meant. I stared at the small statue in shock. How did he get this? I threw it away in Vietnam after my friend died. She shook her head. I don't know. He never explained. Just kept it in his desk drawer all these years and made me promise to give it back to you when the time came. I closed my fingers around the smooth jade, feeling the impossible connection across time and space. Later, when I was alone, I felt both Frank and Donnie's presences, distinct but harmonious within that greater field of consciousness that held us all. You kept it all this time? I asked silently. The impression I received wasn't exactly words, but carried Frank's characteristic wry humor. Found it at a flea market in '83. Knew it was yours the moment I saw it. Some things find their way back when they're needed. Whether this was literally true or a message shaped into understanding I could grasp, I couldn't know. But the jade Buddha took its place on my desk, a tangible reminder of connections that transcended physical boundaries, exactly when I needed that reminder most. By 2010, my health had declined to the point where I was largely homebound. Sarah had become my caretaker, her love expressed now in new ways, managing medications, helping me bathe, reading to me when my vision blurred. Our sons visited often, bringing grandchildren who would climb carefully onto my bed to hear stories about the time Grandpa went to heaven and came back. I worried sometimes that my experience, so vivid and transformative for me, would be diluted into family mythology for them. Just an old man's strange tale, stripped of its power. But then I would catch a certain look in 7-year-old Emma's eyes as she listened, or notice 10-year-old Jack's thoughtful questions, and know that the essence was still being transmitted, seed by seed, generation to generation. The world had changed dramatically since that day in Vietnam, when a sniper's bullet had sent me briefly to the other side. Wars continued, though in new places with new justifications. Veterans still returned wounded in body and spirit. The fundamental human questions remained, about meaning, purpose, what awaits us beyond death. But there had been changes, too, in how these questions were approached. Near-death experiences, once dismissed as hallucinations or religious fantasies, were now studied seriously by mainstream science. Major medical journals published research on them. Universities offered courses exploring their implications. The line between spiritual and scientific understanding had blurred, creating space for new ways of knowing that incorporated both. I like to think I had played some small part in that evolution. My story, one thread in a much larger tapestry being woven by countless others who had glimpsed beyond the veil and returned to share what they had seen. As my physical strength ebbed, I found the presence that had accompanied me since Vietnam growing stronger, more constant. Sometimes in the space between wakefulness and sleep, the veil would thin almost completely, and I would feel myself held once again in that vast field of love and awareness that had transformed me decades earlier. Donnie, my grandfather, Frank, and others I had lost along the way would draw near, their presences distinct yet harmonious within the greater consciousness. These weren't dreams in any ordinary sense. They carried the same quality of heightened reality, of experiencing truth beyond what the physical senses could perceive, that had characterized my original near-death experience. And each time I returned to ordinary awareness with renewed peace and purpose for whatever time remained to me. Sarah noticed these episodes, though I rarely spoke about them in detail. "You've been traveling again," she would say gently, touching my face. Not a question, but a recognition. "Just checking in with old friends," I would reply, covering her hand with mine. Scouting ahead a bit, she would smile, though I could see the mixture of understanding and grief in her eyes. After 40 years together, she knew me better than anyone alive, had walked beside me through every step of the journey that had begun with a sniper's bullet and continued through all we had built together. "Tell them not to get too eager," she would say. "I'm not ready to share you with them yet." But we both knew the time was coming. My doctor spoke in terms of months now, not years. The damage to my heart was extensive, compounded by age and the toll of other health issues. I had outlived most predictions already, stubborn as always. In what would be my final autumn, I asked Sarah to help me do something I hadn't managed in several years. Visit the veteran support group that continued to meet, now led by a Vietnam vet named Ray, who had been one of my earliest group members. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" she asked, concern etching her face. "No," I admitted, "but it's important." "Please." She arranged everything. The wheelchair transport, the oxygen tank I now needed, the timing between medications to give me the most clarity and strength. Our sons insisted on coming too, protective of both their father's fragile health and their mother's emotional state. The group still met in the same church basement, though the faces were different now. Younger men and women from Iraq and Afghanistan seated alongside aging veterans of earlier conflicts. Ray had maintained the core principles we'd established decades earlier. Respect for each person's experience, space for questions without imposing answers, room for both scientific and spiritual perspectives. When Ray wheeled me in, the conversation stopped. Many knew who I was, the group's founder, the man whose near-death experience had created this space of healing. Some had only heard stories about me, passed down through generations of veterans who had found comfort here. "I'm not here to speak," I told them once the initial greetings had settled. My voice was weak, requiring everyone to lean in slightly. "I'm here to listen, to witness that what began so many years ago continues, that the circle remains unbroken." For the next hour, I did just that, listened as men and women shared their struggles and insights, their questions and hard-won wisdom. Some spoke of combat experiences still fresh and raw. Others reflected on decades of integration and healing. A few shared their own encounters with death and what might lie beyond. I watched Ray guide the conversation with skillful compassion, stepping in when needed, but mostly creating space for authentic exchange. I saw in him echoes of what I had tried to do all those years ago, but shaped by his own experience and understanding. The work had evolved beyond me, as it should. Near the end, a young woman who had served as a medic in Afghanistan raised her hand. I wasn't going to share this, she said hesitantly. But with Mr. Jensen here, she took a deep breath. 3 years ago, our convoy hit an IED. I was thrown clear, but something, shrapnel I guess, hit my carotid artery. I bled out before the dust had even settled. The room was utterly silent as she continued. I remember rising above my body, watching my team working on me. Then there was this transition, light, warmth, and a presence so loving, so complete. Her eyes met mine across the room, just like you described in your book. I met my grandmother there, and my best friend who died in high school. They told me it wasn't my time yet. Her voice broke slightly. I didn't want to come back. It was so beautiful there. But they said I had important work to do here still. And have you found that work? I asked gently. She nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks. I'm in nursing school now, and I volunteer with veterans in hospice care, being with them as they transition, letting them know they don't need to be afraid of what's coming next. She wiped her eyes. Your story helped me make sense of mine, helped me find purpose in being sent back. In that moment, I felt the familiar presence surround me again, that vast field of love and consciousness that had never really left me since Vietnam. And with it came a profound sense of completion. The circle was indeed unbroken. The ripples continued, moving outward in ways I would never fully know, but could trust completely. As Sarah and my sons helped me back into the van afterward, I felt a deep peace settle over me. That was what I needed. I told them, to see that it continues, that it was never really about me at all. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning with Sarah holding one hand and our sons holding the other, I felt my heart begin to falter in its rhythm. There was no pain, only a strange lightness spreading through my chest. The presence that had accompanied me for decades grew stronger, more immediate. The veil between worlds thinned to transparency. They're here, I whispered. Sarah squeezed my hand. I know, she said softly. It's okay. My last sight in this world was their faces. My beloved wife, our sons now men with families of their own. My last thought was gratitude for this life I had been given, particularly the second chance that had begun on a dusty road in Vietnam. And then, light, expansion, the sensation of being welcomed home after a long journey. Donnie was waiting, just as he'd promised all those years ago. So was my grandfather, and Frank, and others I had loved and lost along the way. But they were just the greeting party at the threshold of something far more vast and beautiful. That field of limitless love and connection I had glimpsed briefly and spent a lifetime trying to describe. This time there was no return ticket. This time I crossed over completely into the light that had been waiting patiently all along. The presence that had comforted me through decades of living, now revealing itself as my true home, my deepest nature, the reality behind all realities. And yet, even as I merged with this greater consciousness, I remained aware of those I had left behind. Sarah, our sons, their children, the countless veterans and seekers who had found meaning in my story over the years. I could feel their grief, but also the seeds of comfort and understanding already planted, already growing. The message I had brought back from my first crossing, that we are profoundly connected, that love is the fundamental reality, that death is not an end, but a transition, remained true from this side as well. If anything, it was more true, more clear, more complete than I had ever been able to articulate in human language. In the years that followed my passing, Sarah would sometimes sense my presence beside her, particularly in moments of stillness or during the vivid sunsets she had always loved. Our sons would dream of conversations with me that felt more real than ordinary dreams, waking with insights or comfort they needed exactly when they needed it. And occasionally someone who had never met me in life, perhaps a veteran struggling with the aftermath of combat, perhaps a person facing their own mortality, perhaps just a seeker asking the eternal questions, would find themselves drawn to my story. In reading or hearing about my experience, they would feel something resonate deep within them, a recognition of truth that transcended the specifics of my journey. In these moments, the veil would thin once more. The presence that had comforted me for so long would extend to include them as well. And the message would continue its journey, heart to heart, soul to soul, a reminder of the love that holds us all, before birth, through life, beyond death, and always.